Well, I joined the Defense Logistics Agency when it was the Defense Supply Agency back in 1968. I started on July 1st, 1968. And I was with what was then called DCAS, Defense Contract Administration Services. I worked in the region in Chicago. We had an office out at O'Hare Airport. I was there for 3 years, and then in 1971, as the Vietnam War was starting to wind down, there was a fairly major rift, and a lot of the younger folks like myself were caught up in that, and I came out here to the Washington, D.C. area and worked for the Defense Fuel Supply Center, which is now the Defense Energy Support Center. So it's a 33-year time period, most of it being in fuel. I started in 1971 as a procurement agent, contract specialist. Spent several years doing that, buying gasoline and heating fuel and also fuel for ocean-going ships. Worked my way up to a contracting officer, and then that's when I left the agency to go over it with the Department of Energy, and my job there was trying to put together the specifications for the crude oil that we would store in the salt domes, and managing starting up the oil acquisition program there. And when I came back to DFSC, we had a project office that was supporting the strategic reserve because DFSC was buying all of the crude oil that was going to go into the reserve. So I was the deputy project manager in that office, overseeing our support of the Department of Energy to acquire and deliver the crude oil. So I did that for a couple of years, was then selected for director of our market research office. And DFSC's had quite a robust market research effort for a number of years. It leads back to some problems in following the oil shortages in the early 70s. So I did that for 4 years. Really got to know the oil industry and study it, and served as the eyes and ears of the commander on what was going on in the marketplace that we were trying to acquire and deliver products. Then in 1983, I was selected for a promotion as the Deputy Director of our Supply Operations Directorate. We were functionally organized back in those days, and so that job involved determining the requirements for all of our purchase programs, determining how much petroleum products we were going to store and where, what kinds of products to store, overseeing the distribution of mostly jet fuel and ship propulsion fuels. I did that for a long time, until 1995, and then we reorganized along business unit lines. And at that point, I was selected to be the Deputy Director of a new business unit called our Bulk Fuels Business Unit. And we bought and oversaw the distribution and all the quality control for all of the aviation products that DESC supplies to our customers worldwide. So we had contracting and supply and inventory management and quality and a variety of skills that were all brought together in that particular business unit. So I served in that capacity for about 3 years, I guess, and then was asked to take on the job of program manager for a new automated system that we're putting in here called the Fuels Automated System, or FAS. Did that for a year, and then my most recent set of duties have been a new position as Director of Change Management. Here in the office, I remember when I started in 1968, we had a single mainframe computer that supported our finance and accounting office. There was a lot of computer support for paying contractors who supported us, and also for payroll and accounting kind of activities. There was no such thing as a personal computer. I guess it had been invented, but we certainly didn't have any of those in the office spaces. So people either hand wrote correspondence and passed it off to someone who typed it on probably some manual typewriters back then, but certainly the electric typewriter was right around the corner. There were no personal computers in 1968. I think they'd probably been invented or at least thought of, but they weren't in any of the office spaces. We had a single mainframe computer that was in our finance and accounting office, and its role was to support the payroll and the payment of bills for defense contractors, and performed various accounting functions. We certainly didn't have any PCs. People, to the extent they produced correspondence, we had to handwrite a draft of a letter or a memo and give it to a support person who would type it. I think initially they typed it on manual typewriters, but electric typewriters were soon in the office spaces. Well, the industry, of course, has benefited from technology very, very greatly. I guess if you look at exploration for oil, if you look at the ability to bring it to the surface of the earth and distribute it, the technological advances that have occurred there are just phenomenal. There are all sorts of satellite capabilities nowadays to locate oil reserves. There are techniques to bring oil to the surface that certainly didn't exist when I started. They can inject steam into the ground to liquefy oil that prior to that time would have been too thick or viscous to bring to the surface. Just all sorts of advances in that. The transportation of oil, if you look at shipboard vessels now all have the global positioning system capability and much improvements in communications and those sorts of things. Of course, the sizes of ships are much larger than they were years ago, carrying now millions and millions of gallons of oil. It's a very stark contrast to the convoys of small ships that existed at the end of the Second World War, for example. In the refining sector, we see tremendous advances. Refineries are now all computer controlled, so the flexibility to vary the output of the refinery to maximize gasoline, vice some other cut of the barrel of crude oil is very much greater now than it was then. Advances in things like gauging technology and metering of because it's a liquid that we're handling, so you can't count it. You have to measure it in some other way. That's advanced greatly. Leak detection capabilities in storage tanks. We now have all sorts of capability to detect any problems with the integrity of the storage tank and can respond to those things more quickly. So the environmental consequence and benefit of that is obviously much greater. To the extent that we've got a problem, we can spot it much sooner than we could and rectify that before there's some environmental damage. So things like that, just tremendous differences that have occurred in the industry as well. It's called quality of life kind of things. I was thinking about that this morning. And of course, in preparation for this little discussion, I've been going through a lot of old pictures and things, trying to refresh my memory on what things were like a number of years back. course, as you look at all those old photographs, they're very much dominated by middle-aged men, all wearing white shirts and dark suits and looking very proper. Some of them, you see the old hats and things that people used to wear. My desk back in those days did not have a personal computer. We typically would have an in and an out basket because everything arrived in some paper form. There would also be frequently large computer runs where we were unable to quickly disaggregate information and just get access to the particular bit of information that we needed. We had to have a whole ream full of the latest canned run of whatever to consult. Of course, the way material was updated too was we'd hand annotate some listing, and then it would get carted off once a week or something, and somebody would key punch it into a computer mainframe, and then the next week they'd bring back some updated thing for you. It was a very, very cumbersome process. Of course, we had telephones. Didn't look like the phones today. I mean, I think there were probably multiple buttons on the phones where you had a couple of lines that would come in, but certainly we didn't have features like holding and call forwarding and all of those sorts of features that exist today. A typical desk would have an ashtray on it because people tended to smoke more then, and certainly we were permitted to smoke in office spaces. So people smoking at their desk was a common thing. People smoking in meetings was a common thing. I hate to think what that did to my lungs back then. I guess those are the main differences that existed. The energy crisis in the 70s was certainly a defining moment. I mean, not only for the country, but certainly for us in DFSC at the time. The industry had changed radically in the very late 60s and early 70s. The oil-producing nations, many of them nationalized their oil assets and wrestled control away from the international major oil companies. And that didn't have an immediate effect, but over the next 4 or 5 years, that politicized the oil industry. And of course, when the Organization of Arab oil-producing countries, OAPEC, not OPEC, as a lot of people think, when the Arab nations boycotted and cut production in '73, the most noticeable thing from everyone's perspective, I guess, was the price of oil just went through the roof. We saw prices that were unheard of prior to that time. And there were, although they were artificially created, there were real shortages of product. We wrestled with that basic problem for 2 years in DFSC. There was a major allocation program that was put in place. We had to look to whoever supplied us in a defined base period, which was, I believe, calendar year 1972. So whoever you got petroleum from in a particular month in that calendar year was the company that you were to turn to get supply in 1974 or 75. And that was all well and good, but the company that you had as a base period supplier didn't necessarily have either the kind of product that you needed 3 years later, or the amount that you needed, or he didn't have it in the place that you wanted it, or his price was much higher than someone else. So it was a very disjointed and difficult marketplace to try to supply our forces. We had some very close calls in terms of being able to meet mission. I know at one point on the east coast of the United States, we were down to about 5 days of supply of jet fuel for the Navy a very precarious situation. Obviously, if something in the way of a major contingency or something had kicked off at that point, we would have had a very difficult time supporting that. It was a very stressful time too. People were racking their brains trying to figure out ways to outmaneuver whatever the regulations said about base year suppliers, and it was equally frustrating on the oil companies. A free market is sometimes a very draconian thing, but it's a very efficient thing. And here they couldn't use normal business practices and market power to try to win supply contracts with us. They were reduced to abiding by regulations and often having supply that they couldn't supply us because they weren't permitted to. During the fuel shortages, we did have to deliver bad news to customers, military service customers, from time to time. Often that we never failed to supply fuel that was needed for a mission. That has never happened. But there are inventory levels that the services need to maintain for readiness purposes, and we frequently had to tell them that we couldn't get resupply there. They would have to dip into some strategic reserve. That was quite common. Back in those days, I wasn't involved with supplying jet fuel. My responsibilities were supplying fuels for buildings and automobile fleets and truck fleets and things like that, what we called post-camp and station supply programs. And I often had to tell a base that they couldn't get as much gasoline as they might want, or we weren't sure if we could get them a satisfactory complement of gasoline, and they would have to rethink whether they could in fact use vehicles as often as they wanted, or they had to turn the temperature down in the building or something like that. I can remember very distinctly an Army major, his name was Jim Bickford, later Brigadier General Jim Bickford, and the commander of DFSC many years later. When Major Bickford was on the Army Energy staff in 1974, and I was a contracting officer, we had many, I guess we should call them animated discussions on the telephone. We're literally yelling at each other about our inability to supply them with what they needed, or even if we could get the product to them, the company wouldn't necessarily agree to sign a contract. So somebody at the base had to make a local purchase arrangement to get a truckload of heating fuel or gasoline. And it was just a very inefficient process. We couldn't deliver full service. I mean, it wasn't just the fuel, it was also a contract and paying bills and doing all the rest of the support that the Army had been used to getting from us. And here they had to do some of that themselves. So Major Bickford and I had lots of discussions along those lines. And of course it was sort of ironic. We still talk even today and recall those days. It never spoiled the relationship, and in fact later when he was a full colonel and I was a 15, we still continue to have animated discussions about things. So it was a very difficult time back in the mid-70s. The whole period in the mid to late 1980s and on through Desert Shield and Desert Storm was a very challenging period. By that time in my career, I was our deputy director for supply operations. So satisfying the customer's energy needs was preeminent for me. I was, if you will, the main voice to the customer from DFSC. I remember when Iran and Iraq had what was called the tanker war in the late 80s. There were blockades of the Arabian Gulf. A number of Kuwait tankers were reflagged as U.S. tankers so that our Navy could escort them in and out of the Gulf. It was at that point in my career when I got to know the Middle East real well. It was the first opportunity for me to travel over there. And I went to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and a number of the other countries that later were in the news headlines with Desert Shield and Desert Storm. In fact, I remember falling asleep in the hotel in Kuwait one night, and the hotel was probably 10 kilometers at the most from the loading docks in Kuwait. Kuwait's been a big supplier of the U.S. forces for many years, both before the war and since. But falling asleep at night, realizing that a tanker called the Sea Isle City, which had been hit with a Silkworm missile about 2 weeks before, was no more than, it certainly wasn't a silkworm shot away from where I was going to put my head on the pillow. So, and later, during the Desert War, I remembered how I felt the night that I fell asleep in that hotel, and how people who are over there now during the war must have felt. And so I could carry that very vivid thought in my head as we worked to support the warfighters during Desert Shield and Desert Storm. And that was an extraordinary experience. I mean, it's terrible that nations have to fight one another, but our job is to be there when that sort of thing has to happen. Of course, the buildup during Desert Shield was an extraordinary thing, was unprecedented for at least in our lifetimes, our working careers. I'm sure people who worked during World War II felt the same sorts of pressures, but I didn't have that experience. So we had not only to line up additional supplies, but we had to work with the Military Sea Lift Command to expand the tanker fleet, the ocean tanker fleet, dramatically. Something that I'm not sure how well known it is. The Kuwait Petroleum Corporation was our single largest supplier of JP5 jet fuel for the Navy, largest in the world. We get a large supply out of the United States Gulf, out of Texas, but Kuwait was the single biggest source and the only source for the entire Pacific and Indian Ocean. Also a big supplier of diesel fuel for the Navy ships. So when they were invaded and that supply was cut off, a tremendous amount of our supply capability was gone overnight. So we not only had to supply fuel to a huge force that was moving to the Arabian Peninsula, but we also had to replace one of the single biggest sources of supply we had in the world. And companies rallied to our side quite quickly. I mean, obviously there was some self-interest. I mean, the oil companies only make money when they have oil to sell. And certainly the Arabian Peninsula is the backyard of the oil field of the world. So there was self-interest there, but there was also a lot of patriotism. A man named Leon Hess, who is now deceased, but who founded Hess Oil Company after the Second World War. Leon Hess was probably 80 years old or something at that point, very staunch patriot. Is not a traditional supplier of ours, but has always told us that if we ever got in extremis, that we were to call him. And his company alone provided huge quantities of product to us, I mean, almost immediately. And of course, the prices in the marketplace were going up dramatically. A lot of the airlines were having trouble because the price of jet fuel was so expensive that they were losing a lot of money on airfares. And Hess could have probably priced his product in a way that people would have considered was gouging. He didn't do that. We got a fair price and we got delivery on time every time. and that went on through all the companies who supported us. But that was a very, very challenging period. The Military Sealift Command, our partner in all this, faced similar problems in securing additional tankers. We normally at that time operated an ocean tanker fleet of about 20 vessels. And by the time the buildup before the air war began, by the time that buildup was completed, we had 54 tankers in the fleet, and all but probably a dozen of them were within a day or two steaming time of the Arabian Peninsula. So a huge effort to secure all those ships, get them to the place where they needed to be loaded with fuel, have the fuel there for them, and then move them all into the area. Very challenging time. Rewarding in the sense that we had done things that were, I guess, Herculean, at least I think of it that way. But certainly people's lives were at stake, and the successful outcome of the conflict rested on a lot of things getting there on time and on spec, including petroleum products. We were at Cameron Station during Desert Shield and Desert Storm. It was before we moved out here to Fort Belvoir. And the normal operational tempo of the agency was a normal business day. We, of course, have 24-hour capability. We have a duty officer on call 24 hours a day, and frequently had people in our operations center around the clock for various exercises or contingencies or what have you. When Desert Shield happened, we went almost immediately to an around-the-clock operation. Ran 2 shifts for a while, and then mirrored ourselves with the National Command Center and others who were working around the clock. Of course, the Middle East is about a whole workday ahead of us on their normal time. So we have an office in Bahrain. I've had that since the Second World War. And just to maintain efficient communications with them during daylight hours over there would demand that we would work a midnight to 8 a.m. shift anyway. So we went to around-the-clock operations. There were reservists called in to assist with that. Of course, at the same time, we were losing civilian employees who were in the reserves. One of my primary transportation people was assigned to a unit and shipped off to Kuwait. So we had to backfill him with a different reservist, but we did go to around-the-clock operations. The phone, the fax machines, the computers, things were going 24 hours a day. We had, in addition to militarily produced intelligence, U.S. intelligence type information coming into us in classified forms, we were also glued to CNN like the rest of the world. And it was not unusual to find something that we'd see in a classified message at 8 o'clock on Thursday night. It would be on CNN at 6 o'clock Friday morning. But CNN was a very, very valuable source of information to us as well. The pace of work was obviously much faster, much more frenetic, and the importance of what you were doing was quite obvious. I mean, people here have always had a very good sense of the importance of their work and knowledge that the mission that we've got here matters a great deal. But when you can see the results of something you're doing today and how that could affect an operational thing that's in fact on national television tomorrow, and it just brings that home even more clearly. Yeah, DLA has changed a great deal in my 33-year tenure. Of course, I guess you could look to the name change as kind of the embodiment of that. When began, it was the Defense Supply Agency, and supply is a narrower term than logistics. The missions that the agency has taken on have grown immensely over the years. In my own experience in the energy field, when I began, the Defense Fuel Supply Center had about 180 people, and we were a consolidated procurement activity. That was our responsibility. We wrote contracts for the delivery of petroleum products to the military services. We didn't own any of the product that we bought. It was the point of sale, and the bill was paid by the military service that received the fuel. That changed in 1973 with what's called Phase 1 of Integrated Material Management of Petroleum. And at that point, we got a comptroller, we got an element of the Defense Stock Fund, and we capitalized inventory that prior to that point had been owned by the Army or the Navy or the Air Force. Fuel that had been in large oceanfront terminals run by the Navy. The Navy continued to run the terminal, but we owned the product in the terminal. As time went on, the responsibility for the maintenance and repair of all these storage facilities, that mission came to us. Maintaining storage tanks for oil products is not a particularly interesting thing. It's not sexy, if you will. And so it had not been properly done. Not enough money had been spent to maintain facilities, and they weren't in good shape. So when that responsibility came to us, the money, in fact, was fenced to do that. And so we've seen dramatic improvements in the quality of the storage terminals that we operate. They don't leak. They don't give off vapors into the atmosphere. They don't look like run-down old messes that you don't want anybody to see. They're nice, clean, modern terminals now because we have that responsibility. Our mission has grown in other areas. We're just about to take on responsibility for aerospace products from the Air Force. That will occur in October. So we'll be dealing with cryogenics and other very exotic rocket fuels, which we've not done heretofore. We have, subsequent to the Phase 1 of Integrated Material Management, we're now in Phase 2 of that, and we're, in fact, the owners of almost all the petroleum stocks on all the military installations around the world, certainly all the sizable stocks. The point of sale from us to the military service has gone from the fence line to the flight line. We now own everything up to the point where it goes into the piece of consuming equipment, whether it's a tank for the Army or an airplane for the Air Force or a ship for the Navy. We own it up to that point. And all the responsibilities for properly designing those facilities, integrating into them the management of the supply, acquiring the fuel, and making sure that it gets to the customer on time, every time. That's now all on our shoulders. And a lot of the planning that goes behind that has come our way too. As the military services have had to downsize after the wall came down, we've seen big changes in force structure for them. Well, they don't have people on their staffs that can be concerned about petroleum matters like they used to. So a lot of the planning responsibilities are coming our way as well. We have a much greater involvement now in the joint community than we did a number of years back. They depend on us to do a lot of the detailed petroleum liquid logistics thinking for them, if you will, because they just don't have people on their staffs to do that anymore. So big changes in responsibility over the years.